wealthiest country in the history of the world with unlimited resources. Yet, more than 2 months after Hurricanes Irma and Maria struck Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, half of the people there, American citizens all, still have no electricity. Many are struggling to get clean drinking water, and more than 100,000 people have left Puerto Rico alone. This is not acceptable, and we are here today to tell the people of Puerto Rico and tell the people of the Virgin Islands that they are not forgotten, they are not alone, and that we intend to do everything possible to rebuild those beautiful islands. And let me be very clear also, and that is, unlike the state of Texas, unlike the state of Florida, unlike every state in the country which has experienced terrible natural disasters, the people of Puerto Rico and the people of the Virgin Islands, while being full American citizens, they have no United States senators here to represent them, and they do not have full voting members in the U.S. House. Their representatives do a great job trying to represent them, but they don't have a vote, and when presidential elections come, they have no power in determining who the next president will be. That is why we are here today, to demand that the Congress and the White House stand up and do the right thing for the people of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. And we want to make it clear that in doing the right thing, as we rebuild Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands from the disasters they recently experienced, it will not be good enough to simply go back to the status quo, a status quo which has left both islands in poverty and severe underdevelopment. And I want to thank Senators Warren, Markey, Gillibrand, Blumenthal, and Harris, and Representatives Plaskett and Velasquez and Soto for their support of the legislation we are introducing today. And I want to also thank the more than 70 different organizations, some of which are represented here this morning, who have endorsed this bill. And we're also grateful to Mayor Yulin Cruz of San Juan for her support and for characterizing this legislation as, quote, setting the foundation to make Puerto Rico a more equitable, just, and fair society for all, end quote. And we thank the governor of Puerto Rico for his kind remarks. This bill is comprehensive, and it addresses the immediate crises facing the islands, but we don't stop there. It makes no sense to simply put things back the way they were, which is why our bill allows the islands to build back stronger. For example, it is absolutely without any sense at all to rebuild Puerto Rico's antiquated, centralized, and inefficient electric grid that was dependent on expensive and dirty imported fossil fuel. Before the storms, Puerto Rico only had 2% of its electricity coming from sustainable energy. Remember, this is La Isla del Sol, the island of the sun. 2% electricity from sustainable energy is absurd. Virgin Islands have done somewhat better, but nowhere near where they could be going. Beyond rebuilding damaged facilities, our bill makes a major proactive investment in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands infrastructure. Our bill also understands that if those islands are going to grow into the future, they need high-quality education. You can't close schools down and throw thousands of teachers off their jobs. This legislation deals with the $74.8 billion debt. And while we don't go into specifics, we are clear that the debt issue has got to be resolved for the people of Puerto Rico, half of whom live in poverty, not for the vulture funds on Wall Street. Let me also say that our bill addresses inequities in federal law that have allowed the territories to fall behind in almost every measurable social and economic area. Puerto Rico's poverty rate is 46%, unacceptable. Puerto Rico's unemployment rate was more than twice the national average, and that was before the storms devastated their economy. Their healthcare statistics are abysmal, and their high school graduation and college rates are also unacceptable. So what we are here to say is that we will stand with the American citizens of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. We will rebuild those islands better than before the disasters devastated them. Let me now introduce Representative Stacey Plaskett of the Virgin Islands. Stacey.
Thank you so much, Senator Sanders, and thank you all the members that are here, Senator Gillibrand, Senator Nelson, Senator Markey, and of course my colleagues in the House, Nydia Velazquez and Darren Soto. We are grateful, the people of the Virgin Islands and the people of Puerto Rico, that while we do not have our own senator, we have senators that will stand up for us here in Washington. We are working hard to support the recovery of our islands. As Senator Sanders told you, right now in the Virgin Islands, less than 40% of the people have electricity after suffering after Hurricane Irma and Hurricane Maria. Our children now, our schools have been devastated to the point where the children are doing half days and doing double shifts at different schools, the schools that are left. That's unacceptable. That would not be expected on the mainland, and none of you would accept that if that happened in your states. But we are islands, we don't have a vote, and it is the responsibility under the Constitution of this Congress to have responsibility over the territories. And while many may try and say that we haven't done a good job with our finances, Congress has done an even worse job of giving the support to the territories necessary to have the finances in place. Medicaid, Medicare, we are not treated the same. Our schools and infrastructure, not treated the same. Roads, buildings, we are not given the same formulas as the rest of the states, as the poorest state in the United States. And so we are grateful for this opportunity to set a level playing field. We have been through the worst. The Virgin Islands has been through 2 Category 5 hurricane direct hits within 2 weeks. And we are strong people, and we are trying to rebuild on our own. And we are impressing upon Congress and upon the White House to do the right thing. We recognize that they have put off on giving, the White House has not issued the amount of rebuilding funding it's going to give, and I'm very suspicious about what that time frame will look like, and putting the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico away from the states in the rebuilding funding, what they're going to give us, and what are the strings that are going to be attached to that. We're asking that all of you call who you need to call to make sure that the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico are treated fairly in this, that we are given the tools, finally, to be able to build a future for our children and our children's children. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stacey. Representative Nydia Velazquez of New York.
Good morning. Thank you so very much for being here. And let me just thank the senators, Gillibrand, Blumenthal, Markey, Bernie Sanders, who served with me on financial services, and Warren, for being a strong voice for the people of Puerto Rico, our fellow citizens. Let me just set the record straight. The Trump administration's response to this humanitarian crisis in both Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands has been embarrassing, anemic, and shameful. And this incompetent and irresponsible response has meant a loss of life. We may never know the full death count, but we can be tragically certain that it will be higher than what has been publicly recorded to date. 2 months since Maria made landfall, more than half the island is lacking in electrical power. Local economies are devastated. Hundreds of thousands of Puerto Ricans are fleeing to the mainland, particularly the state of Florida, further eroding the economic base. These are our fellow citizens. They have fought, shed blood, and died in every major conflict since World War I. Where this administration has failed to lead, the Congress must step forward. The legislation we are unveiling today will help finally turn the corner on this abysmal response and give Puerto Rico the support and the aid it deserves. The legislation that the senators are announcing, which will be very similar to the bill Representatives Plaskett, Soto, and I will introduce in the House shortly, will lay the groundwork for making Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands whole. It will mean addressing the long-standing Medicare and Medicaid disparity. When people ask, why is Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands facing such a financial crisis, we in Congress have been responsible for the treatment that fellow citizens have been given by public policies enacted by Congress. That must stop, and it must stop today. And in addition to all these steps, we are here united saying that we have to address the Puerto Rico's financial crisis. As many of you know, Senator Warren and I previously wrote to the Oversight Board asking them to call on the court to void Puerto Rico's debt. The fact is, Puerto Rico's debt was an almost insurmountable burden before Maria. Now, it could well suffocate the island's physical and economic recovery. We need to put the people of Puerto Rico before hedge funds and Wall Street investors who speculated on Puerto Rico's debt. These hedge funds are highly sophisticated firms. They knew what they were getting into. So taking together these steps constitute a long-term strategy. While Maria has devastated the island, we should remember that Puerto Rico was uniquely vulnerable because of decades of neglect. So I just want to say to all the senators here, not only this comprehensive legislation will pave the way and will put forward a path for Puerto Rico's recovery and rebuilding so that we invest in the infrastructure, power grid, and education so that our children know that there will be a future in Puerto Rico. That is the most important legacy that we as legislators can leave for the people of Puerto Rico. And I am so glad to be here. I'm very grateful. After crying this morning from a video that my sister sent to me, washing clothes because she's suffering from her back in a big pot with her feet. Shame on us. This is happening in the United States of America.
Thank you. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand.
Thank you all for joining us, and thank you to my colleagues standing with me today. It's been more than 2 months since Hurricanes Irma and Maria slammed into Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. During that time, we have seen time and time again, after natural disasters, we have seen the best of who we are as Americans with an incredible outpouring of humanitarian support from people around the country, whether it's donating their time or their food or their money. Unfortunately, while so many Americans are doing so much, the federal government has not done nearly enough to help Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands recover and rebuild. Inevitably, the headlines will begin to recede and the television cameras will all go home. And when that happens, we cannot allow Congress to forget that our fellow American citizens in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands are suffering. We must all pledge to help these families until the islands are rebuilt and fully back on their feet. Anything less is a dereliction of our duty. I was honored to be able to visit Puerto Rico after the hurricanes to get the facts on the ground firsthand. And from what I saw and I heard, the appropriate response from Congress was very clear to me. We must rise to the occasion and create a Marshall Plan for Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. So far, Congress has done the minimum expected of us by passing 2 supplemental aid packages. I supported them both as a first step, but I want to make it very clear that what we have done to date is insufficient, and the Trump administration's most recent request falls dramatically short. We can't forget, the hurricanes flattened neighborhoods, destroyed the power grids, significantly damaged water infrastructure, which made clean drinking water hard to find. 3 of Puerto Rico's biggest industries, manufacturing, finance, tourism, which drive their already struggling economy, remain severely damaged because the hurricane wiped out so many factories and buildings and hotels. Many people had a job the day before Maria struck and no longer have any place to work. In other words, this isn't just a natural disaster. It's an economic disaster that local governments of Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands cannot dig out of on their own. The federal government needs to move forward now on a massive recovery effort, a real Marshall Plan, and that is exactly what this bill does. This bill will fully fund Puerto Rico's request for disaster community development block grants, which are the most flexible form of federal disaster assistance to rebuild homes and businesses and fund projects that will make the islands more resistant. By providing more than $154 billion in federal funding, this bill will match the enormous scope of damage caused by these hurricanes, and it fixes the systemic injustices that have already made recovery so difficult. It would ensure that there's enough funding to restore power on the islands, and that would go even further to modernize the grid and reduce their dependence on fossil fuels to ensure that they are protected from the next storm. The funding is enough to rebuild their roads, commerce, tourism, so people can travel to their jobs, to school, family members can find each other and stay together. But it also goes further because it provides the assistance to modernize the rest of the infrastructure, their energy grid, hospital, roads, bridges, reservoirs, schools, dams, thousands of buildings and homes, all destroyed by these hurricanes. It will also address Puerto Rico's financial crisis, which has exacerbated the effects of the hurricanes and made it that much more difficult to recover. It helps reduce Puerto Rico's debt, much of which is owned by predatory hedge funds, and it provides Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands with access to liquidity to ensure that the governments can continue to function and provide basic services while they work to recover their revenue base. The bill will help them put them on stable ground so they can move forward in their effort and also not have to worry about being in financial despair. We are never going to turn our back on our fellow citizens, whether you live in New York, Texas, Florida, the U.S. Virgin Islands, or Puerto Rico. On behalf of the families in my state, I want to thank Senator Sanders and all my colleagues standing here with us on the importance of this legislation, and I urge all of our colleagues in the Senate and the House to support a real Marshall Plan and pass this bill as part of the next disaster supplemental package. Thank you.
Representative Darren Soto.
Thank you, Senator Sanders, and thank you to both you, Senator Warren, Markey, Blumenthal, and Gillibrand for sponsoring this important legislation, as well as my colleagues in the House, Plaskett and Velasquez. This holiday season, while so many families are spending time together, enjoying time around the dinner table and delicious food and reflecting on their year, Americans in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands are being left behind. It's been nearly 2.5 months, and my family's native island of Puerto Rico is still in crisis. The Virgin Islands are still in crisis, and over 189,000 of my fellow Puerto Ricans have left their island for my home state of Florida, many of them out of necessity rather than choice. We talk about power to the people. Well, the people of Puerto Rico need power, and the people of the Virgin Islands need power. And the Just Rebuild Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands Act of 2017 will help them get the lights back on. It will help children go back to school, parents get back to work, and seniors to get back to the life-saving treatments that they so rely on. And we could build the grid to the 21st century standards that they deserve, to use more renewables and to be more resilient. We could also provide health care by finally giving Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands Medicaid and Medicare parity. We can also boost local agriculture and improve their economies over the long term. Did you know that Puerto Rico's agriculture stands at only 0.8% of GDP and that the island cannot feed itself? This must change, and it could help the economy in the long term. We must also forgive the over $4.9 billion in new debt that came in a community disaster loan, as well as have a long-term solution to the debt that Wall Street predators are preying upon our island. Forcing Puerto Rico to repay these loans when they're already near bankruptcy is a cruel joke. And finally, we must protect collective bargaining, preserve minimum wage and overtime, and put locals back to work assisting in the recovery efforts. This country can accomplish anything if we put our minds to it and we provide the necessary resources. We appreciate all the good work that this legislation represents, which is a call to action to help millions of Americans in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands who desperately need our help. Because we are all in this together, and united we stand, and united we succeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dick Blumenthal from Connecticut.
Thanks to my colleagues, particularly Senator Sanders and our friends and colleagues from the House for your leadership. In the weeks after the hurricane struck the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, I called for a Marshall Plan because I visited Puerto Rico and saw the historic, devastating effects of this historic natural disaster, which called for a historic response from this administration and Congress. And what we've seen in the last 10 weeks, believe it or not, it has been 10 weeks, is an anemic, abysmal, inadequate response from this administration. It has betrayed all Americans, because we are all Americans in times of humanitarian crisis when it affects any of us as Americans, in Puerto Rico, in Texas, in Florida, in Connecticut, which has the highest percentage of Puerto Ricans of any state in the country. We are proud of our Puerto Rican heritage, and we are proud of the Puerto Ricans who have come to Connecticut from the island. And they are now in our schools and our communities, 1,000 of them in our schools. This measure provides aid for our schools and our health systems in Connecticut and other states where we have welcomed Puerto Ricans seeking to escape the devastation of their island. But relief is not enough. Rebuilding more resiliently is what's required, and that's why this bill is so important. It has the makings of a Marshall Plan for what is needed in Puerto Rico, not just to repair, but truly to rebuild with resilience, rebuild stronger and better. For housing, Puerto Rico can build stronger, more resilient structures that can withstand future storms. For electricity, Puerto Rico has to rebuild its aging and dilapidated energy grid by promoting renewables like wind and solar. For health care, Puerto Rico can avoid the man-made Medicaid cliff coming next month, threatening to deprive millions of people of health care. And for basic government operations, keeping local governments going in the wake of declining tax revenues is absolutely essential. There are a lot of unsung heroes in this story. The first responders who have gone there, the National Guard from Connecticut and other states who have heeded the call, the people of Puerto Rico themselves who have made do with less than most Americans would tolerate for 1 week, let alone 10 weeks. If the people of Connecticut, roughly the same size and population, had to endure 10 weeks without power, there would be outrage, uprising across the state and around the country. And yet, we have abandoned Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands to a lesser fate. We owe them more. We owe ourselves more. We are failing in a moral duty that this nation has to every American. And this measure with the makings of a Marshall Plan, has the real hope of our honoring the obligation that we owe to all Americans. Thank you to my colleagues, and thanks to Senator Sanders.
Senator Elizabeth Warren, Massachusetts.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here today. Right now, there are millions of U.S. citizens in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands who need our help. This bill today helps provide our fellow U.S. citizens with the help they desperately need. This bill is far-reaching. It recognizes just how widespread the devastation has been. This bill is bold. It presents a big plan to confront the huge challenges that this island faces. It is not a set of half measures. This bill is just. It makes clear that this recovery belongs to the people of Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. And this bill is progressive. Its goal is to allow these islands to thrive, to grow bigger and better than ever. And just as important, this bill sends a message. It tells tens of millions of U.S. citizens, we have not forgotten you. This bill does not treat the people of the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico as an afterthought. It treats them as fellow U.S. citizens who need our help. So let the residents of these islands hear us loud and clear. We have not forgotten you, and we will continue to fight for you. Massachusetts is home to more than 300,000 Puerto Ricans. Soon after Hurricane Maria struck, I went to Springfield and to Worcester to meet with people about the relief and recovery efforts. And I heard from many friends and family of those who are in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. They were worried sick about their loved ones, but they were also worried about the future of the islands. This matters deeply to them, and it matters deeply to me. Long before the hurricanes, we fought to improve Puerto Rico's economy. And now, post-hurricanes, we are fighting to ensure Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands get the help they need. Senator Sanders and 11 other senators join me in asking the Trump administration to ensure that the fatality count on Puerto Rico is accurate. We join dozens of our colleagues in urging the Trump administration to put forward a comprehensive relief package for both Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. And there are plenty of other steps that we've taken. We care about this, and we're working hard on it. I want to highlight one central economic point. Puerto Rico needs full debt relief. This is critical. The vulture funds that snapped up Puerto Rican debt should not get 1 cent from the island, not 1 cent. I am working on the details of a debt relief plan for Puerto Rico, and it will fit the sentiment of today's bill. And I look forward to working with Senator Sanders and with all of our colleagues to introduce the debt relief bill in the weeks ahead. From the start, President Trump's response to Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands has been too little, too late. I've been telling President Trump, do your job. Well, this bill is an opportunity for President Trump to step up and do his job. He should get behind this bill, he should lobby for this bill, and he should sign it into law. I am proud to stand here with my fellow senators and our colleagues from the House in introducing this bill. Congress should pass it right away. The people of Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands are counting on us. We must do this. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Senator Ed Markey of Massachusetts.
Thank you so much, and we thank you, Senator Sanders, for your leadership in drafting a comprehensive bill to deal with all aspects of this problem. I thank my colleagues in the Senate and in the House for being here. We are just going to have to insistently, consistently, persistently demand that there be a response to this problem. 2.5 months is too long. We can see what is happening on a daily basis on these two islands. Massachusetts is the home to the 5th largest Puerto Rican community in the mainland United States. It's a vibrant community, an engaged community. And since Hurricanes Irma and Maria have been hit, it has been a mobilized community. We have witnessed an amazing effort by our Massachusetts constituents who refuse to stand idly by and wait for others to provide assistance to the islands. The outpouring of support has been heartwarming, but it is frustrating knowing that Congress and the administration have refused to match those efforts. In the months since the hurricanes hit, this troubling failure of leadership leaves the long-term recovery of the islands in a perilous situation. If the people of Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands lose faith that we will help them, then thousands more will abandon the islands for good. So it is absolutely critical that we not only restore their vibrant communities, but rebuild them in a way that makes them stronger in the long term. These people do not want to leave their islands. They do not want to abandon where they grew up. But they are being forced to leave as waves of immigrants to the United States from other countries in the past decades and centuries have come to our country, not because they wanted to come, but because where they came from no longer provided what their families needed. That is what we are now seeing in Puerto Rico, in the Virgin Islands. People who do not want to leave, who are being forced to leave because the United States government is not helping their own people to stay in their own homes, giving them the education, the health care, the infrastructure, all of the things which they need in order to provide for their families' long-term growth. So these are basically perilous times, and I'm just going to focus on one issue, and that issue is the question of energy inside of these islands, to ensure that there is a greater deployment of energy efficiency and renewable energy technologies throughout the distribution system. The Electric Power Research Institute has estimated that modernizing the United States electric grid delivers a 4-to-1 return on investment through savings of energy, reduced costs, and increased reliability. In Puerto Rico, that is even more the case. We have the opportunity to rebuild Puerto Rico's electricity grid so that it is powered by renewable energy and so that cleaner power can be generated near the population centers and not moved vast distances, which is what happens today. That will make the island less vulnerable to both storms and price hikes. Even now, only about 58% of Puerto Rico's power has been restored. In the United States Virgin Islands, even less has been turned back on. Only 36% of St. Croix's generation, 47% of St. John's, 48% of St. Thomas power has gone back online. We now have the chance to provide the islands with these efficiency and reliability gains, and we should seize this opportunity. And that's what this bill that Senator Sanders and the rest of us will do for those islands. In the past year, in Mexico, they have had auctions to have companies bid to construct solar energy, electricity capacity in that country. It's coming in at 3 cents a kilowatt hour, lower than natural gas, lower than coal. So this gives us a chance to look at Puerto Rico, where it's sunny every day of the year, to reinvent the electricity system, to look at what's happening with auctions in other countries that are just immediately abutting Puerto Rico, so that we can have this incredible change which will take place. The Republicans are trying to jam an unfunded $1.5 trillion corporate tax giveaway through Congress. The White House has made a request of just $44 billion to address recent disasters. Not only was that amount totally inadequate, but they proposed to offset this funding by cutting federal critical programs out elsewhere. Those are immorally misplaced priorities. The first thing you have to do before you're giving tax breaks to billionaires is decide what are the rest of your needs in our society before we give it away. They're turning a blind eye in this White House to what is happening in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. This is the timely moment to have this bill by Senator Sanders introduced, and I think it's now time for us to introduce this into the debate over the tax break as well. This is a moral choice the American people have to make. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you all very much. Let me thank all of the organizations who are going to stand up and fight for this legislation. Any questions from the media that we can answer, perhaps? From the media? Yes, sir.
How and when you see an opportunity to insert new proposals in the majority bill for the reconstruction of the island or in an emergency?
Well, as you know, all of us and many of our colleagues, especially within the Democratic caucus, are going to do everything that we can to make sure that when we talk about reconstruction, it is not just Florida, it is not just Texas, but it is also Puerto Rico, and it is also the Virgin Islands. They're going to get their fair share. And the points that we have made over and over again today, everybody has made, rebuilding it just as it was makes no sense at all. So you're going to see us fighting in every way that we can to push elements of this legislation. Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to ask, you're talking about investing in the infrastructure. So if we talk a bit about the underfunding in infrastructure previously that maybe added to what happened when the storms hit, and talk about the children, how many are being affected, how many are in school.
Right. Well, I think as you have heard today, we have a crisis in infrastructure here in the mainland. Our roads, our bridges, our water systems, our wastewater plants are falling apart. The problem historically has been worse in Puerto Rico and in the Virgin Islands. We talked about an antiquated, inadequate electric system that needs to be rebuilt, but rebuilt in a very different way. And that is true both for Puerto Rico and for the Virgin Islands. So when we talk about rebuilding our crumbling infrastructure, we are talking about not just doing it on the mainland, but doing it in the islands as well. And by the way, when we do that, you're also going to create many, many, many thousands of good-paying jobs on those islands.
I thank you. I just wanted to add something about the underfunding. Congress has made it a point of not treating the territories the same in terms of its funding. While most states receive between 27 and 42% of their general fund comes from federal dollars, in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, it's 14 cents to the dollar. We have been taken out of the formulas for the highways and roads, which is one of the main reasons that as a place like Charlotte Amalie, our capital, was overrun with water. We have not been given the funding for schools. We have not had a new school built in the Virgin Islands in over 20 years. And both of our hospitals were destroyed. If you become sick in the Virgin Islands, if you are a dialysis, have diabetes or other, you are now being shipped off of the island, flown off the island elsewhere. Our doctors have no work because both of our hospitals were lost in the hurricane. And part of that was due to the fact that they did not have the necessary funding that was needed so that they could continue maintenance for the roofs. We have a reimbursement for Medicaid and Medicare that is based on 1980s reimbursement dollars. That has never been changed for the territories. It's that underfunding which caused the damages to be much more. Our children, you asked about the children. We have children that some are going to school at 7 in the morning and they get out at 12. Another shift comes in at 11 because we've had so many schools damaged. And the schools that are there, teachers have walked out. Children have done walkouts in the schools that are still in place because of the amount of black mold and the mold that is in the schools right now. All of the school books damage it, and the kids have no resources in the schools in the Virgin Islands. That's what we're facing, and that's why we're grateful to Senator Sanders and my colleagues who are bringing this bill that will bring us back to the appropriate funding so that we can have a better future in the territories.
But let me just give you a very simple answer. Nobody knows. How many children are in school? Nobody knows. How many roads have been restored? Nobody really knows. Right. How many of those dialysis patients are getting the treatment they need? Right. Nobody knows. What has been missing most egregiously is accurate data and numbers, and people going to the island have been impressed with how much less there is that's been rebuilt than the governments would like you to believe, and particularly the administration.
And all of this is going on in the United States of America, the wealthiest country in the history of the world. So again, let me conclude by simply saying our message to the people of Puerto Rico and the people of the Virgin Islands: you are not alone, we have not forgotten you, and we're going to continue the fight to rebuild those beautiful islands. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Great job.